Despierta. ¿Sabes qué día es hoy? Vas a transformar al mundo haciendo lo que amas. Vas a cambiar las reglas del juego. Vas a mover a otros. Busca, crea, innova, vuela. El mundo te espera. Transfórmalo. Hazlo, UPAEP.
Muchas gracias por venir. Bienvenidos a todos a el siguiente evento en el ciclo de conferencias de ideas. Esta vez tenemos el gusto de aprender más acerca de la comunicación entre culturas por parte de la maestra Olivia Branch, quien es profesora de tiempo completo en el decanato de Lengua y Cultura. Estudió la licenciatura en Literatura Inglesa en la Universidad de Sheffield, Reino Unido, la maestría en Política y Gestión Cultural en la misma Universidad de Sheffield, pero otro campus, Hallam. Tiene 3 años colaborando en la UPAEP impartiendo clases de inglés como lengua extranjera y tópicos de diversidad cultural en la licenciatura de idiomas, enseñanza y diversidad cultural. Anteriormente laboró como profesora en el nivel bachillerato en escuelas privadas de Oaxaca y coordinadora de programas sin fines de lucro en Oaxaca y Birmingham, Reino Unido. Pues creo que va a ser un tema muy pertinente a este nuevo mundo que la UPAEP está también tratando de apostarle. Agradecemos mucho su participación. También a todos ustedes que estén aquí, tenemos por videoconferencia, se está grabando esto también, entonces al momento de tener alguna participación, por favor empujan el botoncito, se enciende la luz verde, quiere decir que nos pueden escuchar los que nos están acompañando, y al final de la participación la vuelven a empujar y se apagan. Muchas gracias, maestra.
Gracias a ti, la verdad, gracias a ti, pues a Juan por invitarme y pues por también el iniciativa de ideas que se me hace muy excelente idea para la UPAEP y me da mucho gusto pues poder compartir esto con mis colegas. También aquí tengo unos alumnos que están cursando pues el tópico de diversidad cultural y sí, me gustaría pues hacerles la pregunta si prefieren en inglés o en español antes de empezar. Como somos interculturales, ¿tienen alguna preferencia? ¿Inglés?
Inglés.
Español. Okay, English. Perfect. So, we're going to change. That's better for me. Obviously, I would like the challenge of doing it in Spanish, but I'm quite happy to leave that for another time. So let me just change PowerPoint. Yeah. So, thank goodness. So, yes, as Juan said, the title of this talk is, Crosscultural Communication. It's related very much to the course that we have here at the university, which is the degree course in Languages, Teaching and Cultural Diversity. Really, the main objective of the talk is to think about how we can improve the communication between people from different cultures. So, we're going to think about 3 main things. First of all, what do we mean by cross-cultural communication? And a little bit thinking about diversity in communication styles. Then we will go on to the barriers. So that's what I really want to focus on today, thinking about the barriers, but most importantly, how we can remove these barriers to intercultural communication. And finally, we're going to think about competencies and some tips. Some personal tips, some competencies that do come from literature and theorists, but also some from my own experience. And I also would like to hear a little bit about your experiences too. So, I'm sure that in recent years you have heard these terms a lot. Here at UPAEP, we hear them, a lot when we're thinking about PFI, about our professional development. We hear this word a lot, intercultural. So, intercultural, when we say intercultural, that means between cultures. So we have heard about this in UPAEP. There have been courses about citizenship. The course that I'm giving right now is intercultural communication, which is communication between people from different cultures. We also hear a lot the word multicultural. Multicultural refers to spaces where we have people from lots of different cultures. It's also kind of an ideology, so it can also be thought of as a policy or something that we want to implement to promote diversity, cultural diversity too. We hear this word a lot more in Mexico than in other cultures. we hear Diversidad Cultural, we have an idea about what it means, but really it's the same as multicultural. It refers to spaces where we have a diversity of different cultures. And finally, we have this very long word that I just realized I spelled in kind of Spanglish, internationalization. So we hear that word a lot at the moment. Well, at UPAEP, we hear it a lot. It's to do with growth. It's to do with an exchange of ideas. It's to do with opportunities too. So all of these words we are hearing more and more recently. And it's because the world is changing. The world is becoming more global. I don't want to mention the word globalization, but it's all really related to globalization. And we can see how it is related to everything that's been happening in recent years. So, first of all, immigration. So immigration has been increasing enormously in the past century. So right now in the world there are 244 million international migrants. So there are people living all over the world. That doesn't even take into the account the number of people who have moved from one place in a country to another city in a country. This is just people that have moved from one country to another. In Mexico, there's around between 1 and 2 million migrants from other countries living in the country. But if we think about Mexicans who live in other countries, that's a different story. There's about 10 million Mexicans that are currently living in other countries. So people that were born in Mexico that now live abroad. So migration is increasing, immigration is increasing. Trade. I didn't put Volkswagen because we hear a lot about Volkswagen, but there are thousands of transnational companies that are working in Mexico at the moment. That means there's more exchange between people from different countries, there's more economic exchange, there's more exchange of ideas, there are jobs, there are people moving between Mexico and other countries. This is Kia, this is a Korean company, I'm sure you've heard of it really, but this is one of the companies that has recently come over to Mexico and has created a lot of jobs, but has also created this exchange between cultures. Travel too. Although it might not seem like it, travel is much cheaper today than it was in the past. So international travel, international flights, people have more opportunities to go to other countries, to see the world, to meet new people. So really this exchange is happening not only in business, not only in immigration, but also in the way we spend our free time. Education, of course. Well, at UPAEP we have lots of connections with universities from all over the world. In my course right now, we have a few international students. We have people from Germany, from China, from Holland, anywhere else, and the United States. So we are receiving more international students, and more of our students are going abroad too. But it's not just about exchanges. It's about exchanges of ideas. It's about working collaboratively. Especially in education, this is more important than really in any other area. If we are working on research and investigation, we have to have connections with people from all over the world. And of course, the internet. We're not just connected because we meet people physically from other countries, but we constantly have connections with people from all over the world in our hands at all times. And really, this kind of connection to the world is something that is really, really like all-encompassing. It's in every aspect of our life. We are constantly in connection with people from other cultures. So, before we think about the communication aspect, I just want to kind of push this idea of cultural diversity, push this idea of multicultural spaces. Because really this multicultural growth and the increase of exchanges between cultures is really good for us. It's good for our businesses, it's good for our cities, it's good for our societies. And there are so many benefits of multicultural spaces. I'm going to put some links if you guys are interested. There's lots of articles that you can read about this topic, but there are benefits for countries, benefits for businesses. First of all, creativity. When we have different ways of thinking, when we have different ideas in a room, businesses are much more creative and more innovative. I think if you see the history of like Nobel Prize winners from the United States in the past 50 years, a huge percentage of those are actually immigrants from other countries who have gone to live in the United States. So this kind of fusion of ideas creates this innovative energy, and people are much more likely to, well, be successful too. More innovation leads to more success. It also leads to more respect. If you have more access and contact with people who are different to you, then you kind of get better at respecting those differences too. It also leads to better interpersonal skills. If you only interact with people that are similar to you, then you kind of know your script already. But if you have interactions and meetings with people from other cultures, then your interpersonal skills will get much, much better. You get better at knowing how to interact with people who are completely different to you, more flexible, more adaptable, and that's really great for a business. It's actually really good for customer services in particular. So as a business, your customer services are going to be better if you have more people from all over the world and more better interpersonal skills in general. Obviously, we said this exchange of ideas is really important. Learning from other cultures, learning from other areas of expertise leads to better problem solving. As a university, as a business, this is incredibly important. And finally, empathy. So empathy, understanding differences, seeing differences, recognizing differences, but also celebrating those differences, being aware that sometimes it's difficult to be different. Sometimes it's difficult to be an immigrant. Sometimes it's difficult for people in those situations, and that makes us have much more empathy towards other people. So, as I said, we're focusing on communication. So communication is really what we need to do in order to interact with people. What do you think is the objective of communication? Who studied communication studies? Do we know? What's the main goal of communication?
To understand the other, to know what he or she thinks, what she or what are her or his interests.
Absolutely.
And knowing each other.
Yeah, you've actually just put two of the most important objectives there. So firstly, to transmit a message effectively so that someone else understands what you actually wanted to transmit, right? Also the second one, you already said, establish relationships. Communication is really, it's not just about a message, it's about lots of other kinds of things that bring us together, especially establishing relationships. Any other ideas? Josue, were you going to say something?
I mean, I actually wanted to say to convey a message, but it's actually the same, transmit a message, so that's fine.
Any other ideas? What's an objective of communication? To exchange. Yeah, it's not just giving information, it's exchange. That's very important, yeah. We'll see a bit about that in a moment. If we think more, these are all very Western ideas of communication, in fact. If we go to the East, go towards China and Taoist or Confucianism, then we can say that communication is often about maintaining harmony. So that's one of the main objectives of communication. It's not just about your message. It's not even about exchange. It's not about relationships. What kind of is about relationships, harmony? But one of the main objectives of effective and good communication, according to Eastern traditions, Eastern philosophy, is to maintain harmony between a group of people, in a society, which I quite like that idea. And I think that when we're thinking about intercultural communication, what we really want to avoid is a conflict. So maintaining harmony is going to be very important. Agree? Or disagree? You don't look convinced?
I guess it depends a little bit on where you are and who the other people are.
That is very true. Yeah. Well, we'll think some more about the objective of communication. Hopefully. There we go. This is actually one of the models of communication that was introduced in the 1970s. This is by Van Lent. As Carlos said, it's not just about transmitting an idea, it's an exchange. It's a constant exchange, and this is called the transactional model. So it's not just about me giving a message and the other person understanding it. It's a constant exchange. It's not just about our verbal message, it's also about the non-verbal cues, the other elements of communication that affect the message. But what would you say impedes communication in any type of conversation? What stops you from communicating your ideas? Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah. That's a very good point. So fear, so emotions, yeah. What else? So what would maybe cause a misunderstanding, that someone doesn't understand you? Language.
Code that you use, probably.
Absolutely. Language and the way you use language, yeah. So if we look at this model, we can see we have a communicator and another communicator. Not just a sender and a receiver, we have two communicators. They both send and receive. We have the messages. We have this of encoding and decoding, which can be problematic, especially when we have very different cultural lenses. And then we have noise. Noise is all around us. So noise is everywhere, and we can't really stop noise from happening. But when we talk about noise, what do we mean? What is noise?
An annoying thing.
An annoying thing. Like when you're trying to teach a class and the gas truck goes by and it goes doot doot doot.
Noise is negative.
Yeah. Sorry?
For example, when you have a problem and you are thinking about that problem and the other people is talking to you and you are not paying attention.
That's really true. Sometimes it's like internal, yeah. Angie?
For me, it would be just like a sound that doesn't convey a message.
Yeah. So something that interrupts, something that interferes. Yes.
But it might convey a message.
Sorry?
But not for you.
The other people communicating too.
Yeah, if you're in a a restaurant, sorry, and there's a lot of other people talking and having conversations, it can be that can really interfere with communication, yeah. Any other ideas? What else would noise be? Sorry? Yeah.
Yeah, some sort of a distraction that doesn't need to be audible.
Absolutely.
It could mean anything. You know, somebody could be playing cards from the other side of the room and distracting you from that communication that you're having with them.
Absolutely. All of those things could be considered noise. In fact, we'll think about what noise does first of all. Noise is kind of a barrier. Noise is an obstacle. Noise is something that creates miscommunication, misunderstandings, and discord. Discord being the opposite of harmony. So if we think about the Eastern traditions again, we want harmony. Noise is what can create an issue. So there are lots of different types of noise. We have kind of what we mentioned before. We have psychological noise. Psychological noise are our own emotions, our feelings, and our perspective. So it could be when we feel nervous, when we feel anxious, when we don't know if someone's going to like what we have to say. Psychological noise is our own prejudices, our own way of thinking, and our stereotypes. That's something we're going to have a look at a lot in the next few slides. Could be physical, so literally physical or, sorry? Oh, yes, it could be physiological. That would be more physiological. When we have a physiological impairment that can affect, like a hearing problem, a speech impediment, that would be a physiological impairment, absolutely. Semantic could be something to do with the words and our choice of words. For example, we have a lot of words that have many different meanings in Spanish and Mexico. I know these are very common and you have to be very careful with the words that you use. I've learnt this the difficult way, that some words you have to be careful with, right? Or just semantic things that could be, for example, like a figurative expression. So when we use an idiom like it's raining cats and dogs, we have to think about, is the person really going to understand what we mean by that? That would be semantic. Environmental, the noise. That's like literally the noise in a space. Environmental factors that stop us from being able to hear or make ourselves understood. Grammatical noise is when there are differences in grammar, for example, it could be even between Spanish from Mexico and Spanish from Spain or Argentina. When we have these differences in grammatical structures that if you're not really familiar with the way of speaking Spanish in Spain, that could cause an issue. But also when you're translating, if the grammatical structure of your first language is very different from that in English or in Spanish, then it's going to be more difficult for you to understand what the person exactly wants to convey. Organizational, this is more in business communication, so when there are certain elements or parts of the organization or the way the organization works that will stop you from really communicating your ideas clearly. Maybe things to do with permission or like etiquette. Who do you have the right to speak to in your role? Who or how can you speak to that person? Do you have to arrange a meeting? Do you have to go to a private space in order to speak? Those kind of things can be barriers to communication. And finally, culture. So culture can be something that creates noise. If we are speaking to someone who comes from a different culture, even if it's from another culture within the same country, then those differences can create a distraction or a problem in communication of ideas. So we're going to think about psychological and cultural barriers today. There are many others, as we know, and all of these could be part of intercultural communication too. But psychological and cultural will be the focus. So, culture, we know, is something that influences many different aspects of ourselves and our lives and the way we act. A lot of the time we think about culture as lenses. It shapes how we see the world, but it also affects how we act, how we behave, how we speak. I say it influences, but that doesn't mean it determines. Your culture doesn't determine who you are or how you are or the way you act or who you interact with, but it does influence it because it's how we learn, it's how we grow up, it's the behavior that we see around us. So we can say it influences, obviously, the language. That's the biggest thing that we can, well, when we think about different cultures, we often immediately think of languages and difference in languages. Then perspectives, the way we perceive the world around us, the way we perceive people, the way we perceive action. Our values also differ a lot from culture to culture. We have our own personal values, of course, and other things that influence the values that we have, but culture does have a big part to play in that. It can affect our likes, our tastes, also our attitudes, our knowledge of the world, our behavior, our beliefs, and also how we communicate. So it's not just language, but it's how. It's not just what we say, but how we say it. And we're not going to go into this too deeply, but I think part of becoming better intercultural communicators is getting to know yourself and your own culture. So we're going to think about the differences in different communication styles across cultures. And we have this table. That's a very famous table. This is basically based on a book by Edward T. Hall, who wrote. He was an anthropologist who worked a lot with transnational businesses in order to try and improve business interactions between people from different cultures. So he worked a lot with this idea of high context and low context cultures. So this refers to how important the context or the shared context is in communication. Do you assume that the other person will understand what you want to say because of a shared context or shared background, or do you have to be very explicit in what you say? That would be a low context culture. High context cultures, a lot of the time we refer to Eastern cultures as examples of high context cultures. Mexico could be a high context culture, but we'll see what you think about that in a moment. And low context cultures would be Germany, the United States, UK. But they have their differences between them. It's not that they will always be exactly the same. They'll always have the same characteristics. So some of the main characteristics of these would be indirect, Do people like to convey their messages with a lot of words and kind of go around the point in circles and circles before they make the message clear? Do they expect people to understand implicit messages, or do they prefer to be very explicit about the message that they want to convey? So status-oriented means how important is status? How important is this idea of power? Is there a big distance between people of a certain social class and a lower social class? Do we use pronouns like in Spanish, usted and tú, or in French? In French? In French?
Tu et vous.
Tu et vous. And in German? And? Thank you. Some cultures, even in Korean, they have different, well, I think in Japanese, they actually have like many other layers of conveying different levels of status. They have at least 7, possibly more, from very, 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 from showing a lot of respect to someone who is in a much higher status than yourself, to showing even a lack of respect to people that you consider to be of a lower status than yourself. In Korea, they even have a different pronoun to say I in formal situations. So it's not just about how you refer to other people, but also how you speak about yourself. Or is it more person-oriented? Like in English, we just have you. And in many other languages too, they don't make much difference between people from different statuses too. In English, we did have different pronouns. We had thou and thee. And you. In fact, you is also, it used to be like the very formal way of referring to. It's like the usted. So maybe we're just very formal to everyone. I don't know how that works. We'll have to think about that. So, another one would be silence. What role does silence play in communication? Or do people think that it's better to constantly be talking in verbal communication? How much tolerance do people have for silence? There's also this idea of self-enhancing and self-effacing. Self-enhancing would be when you like to speak about your positive qualities, when you like to perhaps boast or brag, or it's accepted to talk a lot about your achievements, your even possessions, how good things are going for yourself. Self-effacing, the opposite. Modesty is more important than anything else in communication. It would be completely unacceptable to say anything that would like show that you feel good about your characteristics, your attributes, or your achievements. We can also kind of think about warm. So cultures that express more warmth in their communication and cultures that tend to be colder. In a warm culture, not just to do with climate, but it is kind of related to climate. In warm cultures, people tend to be more expressive. They tend to be more accepting of people showing their emotions in conversation. And in cold cultures, well, the opposite. People who express emotions are seen as being maybe volatile, impulsive, and it's better to be more reserved and contain your emotions to yourself. There's also kind of a difference in the way we express ourselves. So some cultures prefer a more elaborate style of communication. To show perhaps how articulate you are is a very important way of kind of showing your status or showing your level of education. And other cultures would prefer an understated or a simpler way of communicating your ideas. We're not going to go into nonverbal communication because there are so many other differences between cultures there. Between like how much distance is appropriate, how often you can touch someone, how you use eye contact, the gestures that you use, all of those things are very different from culture to culture. But today, we don't have time, so we're going to focus on verbal communication. And I want you to think about it. We're going to do a test. It's not a test, but I'm really interested to see how people in Mexico perceive the communication style of Mexico. So, I'm going to ask you, this is in Spanish, by the way, because I wasn't sure. If you have a cell phone or a laptop or a tablet, we're going to go to this website, and I want you to think about communication in Mexico. You're going to answer the questions. It's related to the different styles we saw in this activity. And then we're going to see if you were right or wrong collectively. But it's not a test, as I said. I want to see your perception. We're going to compare it to what they say in literature, in textbooks. So it's paulev.com, my name, Louise Branch, and then 645. Have you guys used this website before?
Yep.
Yeah? Our lovely colleague Paulina told me about it, so
Yeah.
we've been using it a lot. So there are, I think it's only 6 questions.
Should we start?
Yeah, you can start. As soon as you're on the website, you can start.
Start series. Esto es de lo que nos estaba hablando ahorita. La comunicación se enfoca en el estatus. Ya me dijo la respuesta. Espera, es que estoy en la 3. Sí. Done. Es negativo. ¿Qué? Porque si estoy contigo y me quedo callada aquí, no te sientes bien.
It's difficult, yeah.
¿Eh?
We'll
Bueno,
see
pero por ejemplo, ahorita porque tú y yo we have a good relation.
what you
y
guys
estás
thought.
callada, digo, bueno, ya. Pero si estás con alguien no tienes nada que con quién hablar, por eso la gente habla. La comunicación verbal. Ready, teacher?
You ready? Finished? Finished? Over here, have you guys finished? Yes? Okay, so. Sir? Oh, yeah. So, I'm trying to work out how I can see your responses because it's slightly different than from my computer.
Response history, no?
Thank you.
One more, there.
Perfect, thank you. Not this one.
Había una que decía check no sé qué.
Okay, well, we'll have a look at the questions and we'll see what you guys said.
No, yo quiero ver mi nombre en la pantalla.
So, we're going to be honest. I'm going to check your results later and see how honest you were with me. So what would you say? First of all, the verbal communication in Mexico is direct or indirect?
Indirect.
Yes, of course.
Attention.
Could you give an example of how it's indirect? Anyone?
Yeah, usually when you are writing something, if you have to do an essay or an assignment, you start like talking a little bit about almost everything. As you go around
And you have an intro paragraph.
In an indirect way what you're going to talk about.
Absolutely, yes.
I'm not sure. Do I would say
Non-direct. So not indirect.
this is just an example.
It's an example. Very well, yeah. It could be. I mean, one of the things that we often have, that I have noticed as an outsider in Mexico, that is kind of a way of showing this, is that people in Mexico sometimes
We don't
find it
say
difficult to say no. So they would have a million other ways of putting something off, or even if you ask for directions to a place, and as a tourist, this can get you into problems. So if you ask someone, could you tell me where the post office is, then they will try to help you. And I think it's mostly because they just have really good intentions. It's not, and they don't want to say no. But rather than saying no, people will kind of lead you and say, ay, para allá, pero cuando llegas allá, ya no. And there are lots of other ways of giving directions. Exactly, so that's one way of showing that communication is indirect. Would you say that in Mexico, communication focuses on the person or on status?
Status.
Very good. Any examples that come to mind?
It's starting to change, but just about everybody leads with, hi, this is the college degree I studied, and you may refer to me by this degree.
Very true.
The shorthand is, licenciado tal, ingeniero tal. And if I don't have one of those, or hey, if I have the Trump card,
yeah.
Hi, I'm Dr. So-and-so.
Absolutely, that's a really good example. And I'm not sure if this is as common in other countries as it is in Mexico. I'm not even sure in America if it's as common as it is in Mexico. But licenciado, arquitecto, maestro, all of those things indicate that communication is status. Even the word usted, that's a big indicator that communication in Mexico is status. The next one. Yeah.
Like when you're in your office and then like this student comes and he goes and tells you that, oye, ¿me puedes ayudar? And you just immediately like, just get mad.
Who?
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely, it's offensive. Yeah.
My grandmother was the last of the Victorians.
Yeah.
And she made it completely
square. Yeah, and we've talked about this in class. Like, this is different from family to family. It is changing, but we have, like in our class, we discussed some students that say, like, usted to their grandparents, for example, and others that have always used tú. Yeah. Wow. But I imagine, like, even within the same age group, there will be families that have, like, a more intimate, like, way of communicating, and ones that have, like, a more, yeah. It's been lost. So, Mexicans speak in an elaborate way or a simple way? Elaborate. You guys do know your culture very well. That's good. So elaborate, I think the example that Angie used is a very good example of that. The very long introduction to introduce the topic. Sometimes when I've heard other teachers say this is when students don't know what they really want to talk about. So they say a lot before they get started. Another example would be like CVs or resumes. In Britain, you have to have like a one-page resume. If you go past one page, then no one's going to read it, right? In Mexico, I've seen resumes of about, I don't know how many pages, 5, 6, 7 pages, and it's a very different way of communicating, the style of writing. I get told off a lot by my husband because I don't write in a formal enough style. But I'm used to this. I'm used to a very different style of communicating. Really? Wow. That's impressive. I want to read that. Well, no. No? Yeah.
The way it's phrased at the beginning, the institutional video of UPAEP, a few years ago they sent me the text because they wanted to have it translated into English. It was impossible, really impossible. Even the words that they're used, perenne. Excuse me, how do you translate that? It's really a very elaborate, as we say it in Spanish, no? Rebuscado.
Yes.
That's the word to really explain it. No?
Absolutely.
Rebuscado.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's quite interesting because one of the things I've gotten to do for the university is help review like international agreements. And it's amazing that our lawyers can stress lawyers in other countries out.
I can imagine.
And so we had agreements that were stuck for years simply because we had gone with a straight up translation.
Yeah.
You know, like other lawyers are having to look up what a moral person is. You know, like UPAEP, it being a moral person. You know, who are we? Right? So we're glad, we're appreciative.
Very good point.
And so things that have been stuck for years,
yeah.
Once you get rid of a lot of that language,
yeah.
Man, we had things that cleared in a couple of weeks, you know, after they'd been in limbo for 2-3 years.
Yeah, it's not just about translation, it's completely changing the style.
Try to explain that to a person that you really have to get rid of all that extra wording. And 6-minute video becomes a 1.5-minute video, and they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, very true. And yeah, I've definitely had that problem with translation too. The final one. Do you think that Mexicans express their emotions or hide their emotions? They hide them?
For example, are you okay with this? Oh, yes. Okay.
Ooh,
no?
Interesting. Well,
yeah, I have that same problem with your silence and with this one because to me the answer depends on the status question.
Yeah.
Because, like, if a boss comes in, he's like, all right, guys, so this is the new plan for this week. Anybody got any opinions? There'll be dead silence in the room.
Yeah.
Except, of course, for the one crazy gringo that's in the back, like. And then everybody just turns around and looks at you like, oh, you again, you know. And the same thing to me would go with the emotion thing. So
yeah.
If we're within a comfort group, man, we will speak to each other in a way that other people would find difficult to be so open. But if the status is involved, then absolutely not. I will lie to you about everything I ever felt.
Yeah.
Is this a great idea? Absolutely. I find it wonderful, and I'm glad to simply be in your presence.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what it's about. It's because the way we communicate in countries where status is more important than the individual, then the way we can see that is that the way people communicate with people in high status changes enormously than how they would communicate with people in their intimate circle. And absolutely, we have, I mean, if you read the literature, this is why it's interesting, because I could tell you what the books say about Mexico, but the books aren't always right, which we've seen in class and we will see a little bit in a moment. The textbooks they're not as up to date as they could be. It's just based on a few people's perspective or an outsider's perspective, but really, well, Mexican people are the experts on how people communicate in Mexico. So we can say here most of the textbooks will say that people are more expressive with their emotions in Mexico, even in business meetings, especially in business meetings. It's okay to show that you're angry. It's okay to show that you're happy. But in our own experience, I would agree. Like in business meetings, it's important to keep calm and to not express anger or disagreement sometimes. Yeah, very, very true. Okay, well, we'll go back and we're going to think about this. What happens when people with different communication styles interact? So, as he said, it's not just about different languages, different cultures that are enormously different. What happens when someone from a direct culture is communicating with someone from an indirect communication culture? An example. From British English, we have a British person, like me, communicating with an American culture. I don't know, do we have yes, okay, well. British English, it's rather warm in here. Silence, right? Wait. I could do with some fresh air. Nothing. Crickets, right? We can hear the crickets, it's so silent. Finally, do you think someone could open a window? Finally, we get the point across. Whereas an American would just say, open the window, please. We have very, very different styles of communicating. In British English, we tend to word things with almost in a Mexican style, I have to say, but very, very, very polite. Excuse me, sir, I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but I wonder if you would mind helping me a moment, as long as it's no trouble to you, of course, rather than just being direct and saying help. So, there is a huge difference. We kind of, as English teachers, we have to be aware of this a lot, especially teaching our students to communicate with native speakers. But it's also a global language too, so the differences across cultures are going to be enormous. So, we're going to think about this, intercultural communication. It's not just about differences in the verbal communication styles. It's not just about the language that we speak. We're going to go through quickly, because I don't think we have that much time, the barriers to intercultural communication, and think about how we can remove those barriers too. So, I know language is an issue. Language is something that is important to consider. Our language proficiency, do we speak the same language? Do we speak the same lingua franca? Is our second language perhaps the same second language as someone else? If we're speaking to someone from China, perhaps they don't speak Spanish or English, perhaps that person speaks French and we can communicate in our second or third language. But it's not the only barrier. Like, we can speak the same language, but there can be lots of other things that can stop us from communicating effectively. So, the first one is really important, and it refers to those that psychological noise, right? Those little voices we hear in our head, and it's anxiety. And I think we all have this. What if I say it wrong? Especially if it's in our second language. What if they don't understand me? What if I don't know what to say or how to act? What if I offend them? Those are all thoughts that we're having constantly in daily interactions, but maybe not all of us, but we often have these. But when we're speaking to people who are unfamiliar, that means especially people from other countries whose culture we're not really aware of, we experience something called identity vulnerability. We don't know how to act. We don't know what they're going to think of us. We don't know how they're going to see us and how we like to think of ourselves. We have our self-image, our identity. That's something that we protect fiercely. A lot of our interactions are to do with building this sense of identity, with building our self-esteem, with making ourselves feel comfortable with who we are. But with unfamiliar people, we don't know what's expected, we don't know how to act. And I mean, it's a silly question, but how many of you guys feel anxiety when you have to speak a second language? Yeah? Yeah? Or a third language? Or fourth language? So it happens to all of us. Like, I was very relieved when you said you wanted to hear the talk in English. I want the challenge of giving it in Spanish. I like to speak in Spanish a lot, but it's a very different thing speaking in your second language in front of people that you haven't met before, in front of your colleagues, giving a presentation. It's completely different than having a conversation with your friends, right? And we all experience that. So, assumptions. This is another huge barrier, and many miscommunications happen because we assume something that simply isn't true. And sometimes we assume that people are similar to us, and we do that more often than not because we like to see other people, especially if we like that person, we like to assume that they're similar to us, right? But we can also wrongly assume differences. So we know that there are many differences and many different things that we can make assumptions about. Values, perspectives, beliefs, communication styles, attitudes, business, etiquette, clothing, approach to time, all of these things differ enormously between cultures, right? One example would be this one. So, Ryoko, my friend, didn't answer the professor's question immediately. The professor assumed that he did not understand the question. What do you think was really happening? Any ideas? Well, it's to do with this, what we mentioned before. It's to do with silence. So for us, well, for me, silence is uncomfortable. Silence is negative. Silence is often sometimes a punishment, right? If you're giving someone the silent treatment, that's because you're angry with them, right? Silence is something that in Britain we like to fill. We like to fill the silence. We like to break the silence, right? And we use this thing called small talk. Have you heard of it? Small talk, how's the weather, how's your family, but you're not really that interested, you're making conversation. Oh, this tea's nice, right? So just making conversation for the sake of making conversation, for filling the silence, right? But in Japan it has a completely different meaning, right? It's a sign of respect. If someone says something to you, someone asks you a question, it's a sign of respect to wait and show that you're thinking about how you're going to respond to the question. And it's a very important element of communication. It's an important aspect of culture too, to show respect. We've mentioned before that Japan is one of the cultures with the biggest power distance in terms of people in different levels of society, with many different ways of showing respect and status. But silence is one of those ways, and it's very, very important to be aware of that. And rather than being like, oh, you didn't answer straight away, let's go to the next student, well, kind of be aware of that. Give the student time to answer the question. So the next one is stereotypes. So stereotypes, we hear this as a very negative word, and it is something that we have to work on, but we all have stereotypes about the world, and it is part of the way our brain works, right? Our brain, we need to put things into categories in order to understand the world. We need to put things into categories of colors, or like furniture, table, chair, lamp. Those fit into the category of furniture. It helps us to understand the world. It helps us to know how to behave, how to act, how to speak. But the problem with this is we only see what we expect to see. So if we have a preconceived idea about someone because, oh, he's a member of a certain group or she's a member of a certain group, then we change our actions, we change the way we communicate with that person based on what we expect to see. We don't see that person for who they are. We don't really form a connection with that person because we're basing everything that we think about this person on what we already thought. This guy has been in the press a lot recently, Apu from The Simpsons. Have you seen the newspaper headings about The Simpsons? Did you see the episode? Apu he's a character that really reinforced a lot of stereotypes about South Indian people, or South Asian people. He had a very strong accent. He was a workaholic. He worked at a convenience store. He had lots of children. He had an arranged marriage with his wife. He was the epitome of stereotypes of Asian people. There's even a movie made by an Asian actor called The Problem with Apu. It's a documentary. It looks really good. I haven't seen it, but I recommend it. But for a long time, this affected how people in the United States and all over the world saw Indian people. This representation of a very stereotypical character, we all know it. We've heard these Indian accents in Spanish and in English. We've heard people imitating Apu. So there's lots of examples. These are my examples. So I hear this. This is my conversation with taxi drivers all the time. So every time I get into a taxi, I hear, de Inglaterra, ay, los Beatles. That's like the first thing that anyone ever says to me. I don't like the Beatles. I have to say, I don't mind them. But I don't like them. I prefer the Rolling Stones or other groups. I don't know. I don't really like the Beatles. I don't know anything about them. I can't have a conversation. I don't know anything about Liverpool either. For us, Liverpoole is like a dangerous city in the north. It's not the home of the Beatles. And on days when it's cloudy, honestly, I hear this so often. Le ha de gustar este clima nublado, no? You must love this cloudy weather, because you're English, right? You must love it. Like, that's why I'm in Mexico, because it's sunny. Okay. And, allá todo está mente, no? That one's true. That is literally true. Like, I'm not going to lie, that one is true. It's some stereotypes are based on truth, some stereotypes are not. Some stereotypes are positive, and some stereotypes are negative. Here we can see some of the negative stereotypes of British people, like bad teeth, very grumpy, bad attitude, big problems with French people, especially based on football, hooligan. Those are the negative stereotypes, right? Alcoholic. There are lots of negative stereotypes. The British too. And the Scottish and the Welsh and yeah. So these are negative stereotypes. There are positive stereotypes, like that Mexican people are really warm and lovely and very friendly. In fact, what stereotypes can we think of about people from Mexico or people from France or people from Germany? What stereotypes have you come across? Or I'm not going to... People from the United States of America. What stereotypes can you think of? We know this character, right? Speedy Gonzalez, the epitome of Mexican stereotypes, probably the reason that we associate sombreros and ponchos with Mexico.
I got one, Lou. When I was living in the States, I was living in Minnesota, so there are lots of Native Americans there, and I wanted to go to see how you call that? Reservation? Yeah. So I wanted to go there, and my host mother was like, seriously, Angie, do you want to go there? And I was like, yeah, I want to go there, and I want to see it. And she was like, there's no reservation anymore, it's just casinos there because the law is different there. So actually we went there, and there were casinos there, and Native Americans go to school just like us, they dress just like us, and they dress with their costumes and everything as we do, like in Mexico's independence and these kind of things. Absolutely. So in that way, I was like the one with the wrong stereotype. Yeah. But I also remember when I arrived there, the first question an American asked to me was, are there any trees in Mexico? And I was like, seriously? And he was like, or is just cactuses there?
That's what I thought. I mean, that was my next question about stereotypes that you guys yourself has held. Yeah?
Way back in the 90s, this is in a town that had less than 100,000 people. Somebody in that town asked me, like, so from Puebla, do you see a lot of burros walking outside of your house? And I said, no, but driving, there's lots of burros driving. And the person was just very confused. And I'll be happy with that joke, you know.
The burros, yes, of course.
I'll tell you another story. I studied in New Orleans. My mother was born in New Orleans. So when I arrived at university there, the first thing that happened to me when I walked in is one of these fellows, you know, New Orleans people, came up to me and said, oh, so you're from Mexico. How are the drugs down there? Can we get them?
Oh, gosh.
I said, Lord, I don't know. I really don't use them. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, yes, so negative stereotypes. Any French stereotypes, Fleur, that you've come across?
I've been asked, I think, 200 times, and I'm not exaggerating, if I do take showers.
Yeah.
If it is true that French do not use soap or don't take showers, or maybe once a week. And it's been a real question I had to answer at least 200 times.
Yeah.
The first time, it's surprising. The second time, still surprising. The third time, it begins to get annoying.
Yeah.
After 100 times, more than annoying, but still you get this question. And, I mean, I've been answering the question for more than 25 years now.
Yeah.
And I do take showers.
Thanks for confirming that.
That's with the propaganda machine.
But we have other problems with it.
Mostly football related, I'm sure. So, well, going on from stereotypes, we have prejudice. This is, I think the translation sometimes gets lost here between Spanish and English. Prejudice is a much, much stronger word than stereotype. It's not just about preconceived ideas. A prejudice is really dislike or hatred of a group of people because of their race, their nationality, their political views. I'm sorry, I know people have class to go to. Please go to class. Their political views, their gender even. These are some of the things that people will base a prejudice on. Psychologists say that this is often related to an authoritarian personality type. So certain types of people are more likely to have prejudice than other people. But we can see this kind of groups, mass prejudice in countries like, these are headlines from the United States. United Kingdom. This is one of the famous tabloids, and we have a lot of prejudice right now about Islamic citizens, about Islamic immigrants too. It's kind of related to this idea in social identity theory too, in social psychology, of in-groups and out-groups. We tend to think that the group we belong to is somehow better than other groups. We think that other groups have to be, we like to create a contrast between our in-group and other groups that we do not belong to. So we see our groups as being better than other groups sometimes. It's kind of a natural, sometimes it's just a natural way of acting, but we have to be aware of it, and we have to be aware of our own perspective, our own prejudices, our own ideas about the way the world works. This is probably the most negative barrier because it leads to discrimination. Like, you might not even want to talk to someone. This might be a barrier that's so great that it would stop you from even having a conversation with someone. So we have to be aware of that. And I'm sure we do all have prejudices. We have to work on them, but we do all have prejudices in some way. So we can have a negative stereotype. It will lead to a prejudice, which will lead to discrimination. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I grew up in a household that came out of the Second World War.
Yeah.
So mentioning Germans, mentioning Japanese in the house was practically forbidden.
Yeah.
Then in my younger life, when Argentina invaded the whole thing, my mother, the first thing that did in the house was put a British flag in the Union Jack in the
Wow.
So
that's a big statement.
that's it.
Yeah.
You don't talk about anything else but that.
Wow.
If you want to talk about something else, go outside.
Yeah.
So that, of course, changed.
Yeah.
I think prejudice do have a cycle.
Yeah.
For example, right now it's Muslims, maybe, who knows what happens next year.
Yeah.
So it's cycles and it depends a lot on what's happening around it.
That's very true. Yeah. Were you going to say something, Angie?
Yeah. Well, I think that sometimes that is due because of two different reasons. One could be experiences, like, for example, I have friends from Spain and they were wondering if they would have trouble coming to Mexico because of the conquer. And I was like, no, you're not going to have any trouble. But also there's a lot of prejudice because of the media.
Yeah.
I remember when I was young, like in the 80s, 90s, the bad guys were Russians.
Yeah.
Now, then they changed to Muslims, and now they are changing to Mexicans and Latins.
Yeah. But they like to bring the Russians up once in a while.
Yeah, now it's saying that.
Yeah.
But yeah, sometimes it's even because you are, I don't know, like, you're watching things and you're getting the perspective of other people.
Yeah.
But that builds something in your mind, and then you have that prejudice for a community that maybe you don't even know, and you haven't had any contact with them. I was watching a TV show, and I think it's from Turkey. I don't remember, but they were the good guys with the Russians. So it was like, when I was watching it, I was like, but wait, they are not the good guys. So it was to watch the other perspective.
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the word we use a lot for that in English is the scapegoat, and like the media is definitely responsible. Politics also like to create a scapegoat when things are going bad in a society or in a political situation, or to take attention away. Absolutely. I mean, the biggest example of how this could create like a physical barrier between people from different cultures would be segregation. Segregation happens all the time. But in the United States and South Africa, it was like de jure legal segregation of people, which led to physical separation, which led to a lot of inequality too. So The final thing is ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is basically when we judge the world based on our own cultural parameters, when we think that everything should be kind of like as we do it, or that our way of doing things is the best way. It would be like if I said, why is everyone driving on the wrong side of the road in Mexico, or in France, or in Germany, or anywhere else in the world? Because in England we drive on one side of the road, so everyone else should drive on that side of the road too, right? Or in this one, we have, how do I get to the other side? You are on the other side. It's kind of, yeah. So, I like this example. I like to talk about food, because in Mexico, if there's one thing that people are really, really proud of and think that is probably better, and it is very good, than in other parts of the world, it would be food. So there's nothing better than Mexican food, right? And this is often the thing that people talk about when they go to other countries. That's the biggest thing, like the most difficult thing to get used to, right, is eating different types of food, or just not having Mexican food, right? I think that's the biggest problem. If you go to England, you will have a big problem in that respect. If you have been to England, you'll know Mexican food does not really exist. It could be also the ethnocentric no pica. We know this expression when talking to people from other cultures, that that's based on your perception of what is spicy and what is not spicy. It could be like this. No sé cómo pueden comer cucarachas en algunos países, pero qué rico los chapulines, no? Like there are these ethnocentric things. What is that? Jeez, got a little bird in here. So we do hear this a lot in class, and we hear a lot of people talk about how weird it is to eat insects in other countries, but in Mexico, we eat all kinds of insects. Do you guys like to eat insects? I like my chapulines. I had chapulines yesterday, actually. I know you do. Well, those are 5 main barriers. So we've seen anxiety, assumptions, stereotypes, prejudice, and ethnocentrism. And barriers, they can be physical, symbolic, legal, social, economic, imposed, and a lot of these barriers we ourselves create. They are inside of ourselves. So we can remove these barriers, and we've seen barriers like literally physical barriers, and we hear people talking about putting up a wall between the United States and Mexico. Okay. Hello. Hello, our friends online.
¿Alguien en línea está tratando de hacer un comentario? Hola.
Sounds a bit scary. Sorry, que no me escuchen. Lo siento. Okay. Dicen que no. Sorry, guys. If you do want to say something, say something. So the barriers that we create are the ones that we are in the best position to really remove. And those stereotypes, all of those things that we ourselves hold, are the things that we really can work on. And that's one of the biggest and most important things when we are thinking about how to improve or how to take away these barriers. So we have, first of all, no. This one, right? Is it this one? Okay. So the first thing that we need to do is to know ourselves. So we need to ask ourselves the questions, where do I come from? Like, what culture do I come from? What cultures do I come from? We don't just have one culture or one cultural identity. A lot of the times we are multicultural. We have different influences. We have parents from all over the world. We have children who are perhaps of a different culture from ourselves. We were born in a different state, and now we live in Puebla. We spoke a different language when we were younger, and now we speak many different languages. We are members of different cultures. And also, we need to ask, what stereotypes or prejudices do I hold about other groups of people? How do I feel about interacting with unfamiliar people? How do I act? Am I open to other people? am I myself? Or do I change how I am when I speak to people who are different from me? We need to get to know ourselves. We need to get to know our strengths, our weaknesses. We need to recognize our strengths, our stereotypes too. We need to be very conscious of this. And this is something that we hear a lot, the word like mindfulness. We need to be aware of who we are, how we interact with other people. The second is to learn from others. We can investigate about cultural traditions. If we're going to meet someone or if we're going to travel to another country, we can investigate about the traditions, behaviors, values, and communication. But we're never going to be able to read everything in a book. And as we saw, books aren't necessarily the most reliable source of information about a culture. We need to, well, first of all, observe. We need to see how people act in certain situations. If we don't know how to act ourselves, we need to see what other people are doing. We need to listen. How do people talk? What do people mean? And ask a question. There's nothing wrong with asking a question, right? So, one of the reasons that these books about cultural norms, the taboos, the do's and don'ts, gestures, one of the reasons that these books aren't reliable is because cultures are dynamic. They change constantly. They change over time. I can see here in Puebla that the culture here, I've only been here for 3 years, but the culture has changed enormously in those 3 years. The city has changed. The people has changed. There are new people. There are new attitudes. There are new everything. So, and obviously also not everyone is the same. So just because you belong to a certain culture doesn't mean we can generalize. Doesn't mean we can make doesn't mean our expectations are going to be true. So this is just an example from Mexico. I don't know if this is true. What do you think? This is about gift-giving etiquette. It says, if invited to a Mexican's house, bring a gift such as flowers or sweets. Do you have to do that in Mexico? No? Sometimes? Not anymore. You could, yeah. What about, do not give marigolds, cempasúchil, because they represent death. Is that true? No? Could you give marigolds? Would that be okay? I would feel a bit weird about giving marigolds, I have to say. Yeah. What about red flowers? It says red flowers have a negative connotation. Red roses are lost. Yeah. And do you think that's a negative thing? They might think that you want something romantically with that person, perhaps. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, really? Yeah. So it depends on the person, and these rules, this is on like a website that's designed to help people in business interactions with Mexico. Apparently white flowers are okay. Do you think that's okay if we give white flowers? So they have very specific rules on these websites. Yes. Lilies, yeah. Yeah. Yes. No, absolutely. Or you'd ask them, yeah, absolutely. Well, the final one, it's only 3 tips. Communicate. So just forget about anxiety, forget about your nerves. Speak and make mistakes. We're always going to make mistakes, even in our first language, but in our second language, we're going to make many more mistakes. Try and be inclusive. Like if you see someone from another culture who's new to the UPAEP or who's new to the city, try and include them in what's going on. We all know what it's like to feel like an outsider, even within our own country. So it's a good opportunity to include someone and to learn about another culture, another person. And we'll travel if you can. That's my tip. So this is kind of based on one of the models of intercultural competences. This one's by Stella Tingtumi, and she has 3 main areas. First of all, mindfulness, knowing yourself, self-reflection. Also, sorry, this was in Spanish. Cultural knowledge, so knowing about other cultures, not necessarily about this culture in specific, like particularly this culture, but knowing in general about differences and types of differences that can exist. and also your interpersonal skills. And she says that there are lots of attributes that will help us to be better intercultural communicators. For example, flexibility, not yoga flexibility, but flexibility in behavior, in timing, in your expectations too. Also, openness, having an open mind, or just being open to talking to other people, right? Adaptability, adapting to life, adapting to different ways of doing things, different ways of speaking. Tolerance for ambiguity, so when things go wrong or when things are not clear, it shouldn't really affect us, right? Respect is an obvious one, and that's something that's very important in intercultural communication. Sensibility or sensitivity and creativity. And these attributes are things that will lead to abilities or interpersonal abilities. And my final tips are these ones. We're coming to an end. First of all, the most important things are just to listen, observe, and not be afraid to ask questions. Secondly, this is kind of obvious, but I see a lot of people don't do this, especially if I think about my brother's very articulate and his way of communicating is very English, and he doesn't really know how to change his way of communicating when he's speaking to people who don't really speak English very well. So when he's speaking to my husband or my cuñadas, he doesn't moderate his way of speaking. He speaks with a lot of like colloquialisms and in a very ornate and very difficult to understand way, with a very, very strong British accent. So try and use simple language, right? I know in Mexico it's almost impossible because there are so many expressions and like double meanings that people have and people use. But try and just use simple and direct language. Also be aware of your own cultural lenses and your stereotypes and how you communicate. So I guess that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. If anybody has a question for Louise.
I guess we had lots of questions all the way through, or comments. Thank you for your comments. I appreciated the interaction and that everyone shared a little bit from their own experience, so thank you. And thank you to anyone online. Do you have questions? Smiley face or a shocked face.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. It's a little gift.
Thank you very much.
Some of that communication and an UPAEP specific pen.
Thank you very much.
To go, a small reconocimiento.
Thank you very much.
The time you spent here.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for coming. It's always great to build on these series, to build on the knowledge that we're able to share. I've enjoyed maybe 200 of these conferences, and I think they've made a better person, an academic and researcher.
Despierta. ¿Sabes qué día es hoy? Vas a transformar al mundo haciendo lo que amas. Vas a cambiar las reglas del juego. Vas a mover a otros. Busca, crea, innova, vuela. El mundo te espera. Transfórmalo. Hazlo, UPAEP.